It's a 12.5-inch quilt block, finishing in your quilt at 12 inches. And it's a 9-patch. And I've used 2 colors today. You can use more if you like, but I really love the effect of just the light and the dark. Makes a beautiful quilt. So let's start off at the design wall. I'll show you the 9 patches that make up the block. Here you can see 2 of the blocks that I've completed. And here are the 9 patches that I talked about that comprise the block. And it's basically a 4-patch and a half square triangle. You make 5 4-patches and then 4 half square triangles. So let's get started. I'll show you how to make the block. For the half square triangle patches that make up the block, you'll need to cut 2 5-inch squares of each your dark and your light fabrics. And to construct the 5 4-patches, I'll be strip piecing them together. And you'll need to cut from each your light fabric and your dark fabric a strip at 2.5 inches wide by 26 inches long. To construct the 4-patch, start with your long strips. Place them right sides together. And you'll be sewing a 1/4 inch seam right along the long edge. And you'll want to line that up exactly at your machine. You can use pins if you like. I'm not going to use pins today. And if they're not lined up exactly at the end, that's okay because we're going to be trimming off the end. I made the strips 1 inch longer than is necessary so I'd have some wiggle room to trim them. All right, I have my 2 strips lined up. I am using a leader fabric, and that just makes sure that the bobbin thread doesn't bunch up on the back of my strip set. And I'm actually sewing this together today with a scant 1/4 inch seam. And on this machine, I was just able to move my needle just a tad, about a thread's width to the right. And that makes my 1/4 inch seam just a little bit more narrow, which I find really helpful when I'm piecing together quilt blocks. And again, I'll just kind of line up as I go. And to press the strip set, have your darker fabric on top. And I just set the seam with the iron, and then I will flip it over and just give it a little finger press at first. And then pressing toward the dark simply means that you're pressing toward the dark fabric, and that will ensure that when your quilt is finished, there's less of a chance that that seam allowance will show through the darker fabric. And I'll just keep pressing the entire strip set. First, I'll trim off my short end to make sure that the end is nice and straight. And I'll cut the strip set into 10 2.5 inch segments. So I really like this ruler because it's very clear and easy to see the markings. So I'll line it up at my 2.5 inch mark, which is right here. And I'll continue on and cut the rest of the strip into 2.5 inch segments. Now simply take one of your 2.5 inch segments, face up, and I have my light here, my dark here, so I'll take another segment, put the dark on top of the light and the light on top of the dark, line up, and you can see your seam allowances will be going in the opposite direction. And if you want to use a pin here, you can pin them together. And it's really important when you take it to the machine to sew. We're going to sew a 1/4 inch seam right along here. And this is crucial to make sure you line up your seams right here. You can use a little dab of glue, pins, or you can just hold it together and sew. Okay, I have my patches lined up at the top and on the sides. And I will chain piece these. That just means I'll be feeding them right through. And I'll continue on. And I'll just clip these apart and take them over to the pressing area and give them a press. I'll set the seam, give it a little finger press, and press. And I'll repeat that with the other patches. And another way to press your 4 patches, if you like, a lot of people like it because they seem to lie flatter, is just, if you can see on the back, remove your stitch right here and right here on the back. There might be 1 or 2 stitches depending on your stitch length. And then open it up, and it creates a little miniature 4 patch on the back here. And just give it a press. So now you would be pressing this seam in a different direction. And then you just continue around like so. And that's just another pressing option for you. And after I've pressed my 4 patches, I always like to do a double check and make sure they measure 4.5 inches square. And do any trimming if I need, or take it apart if it's too small. But this looks really good. And I'll just keep checking the others. Start with your lighter colored fabric, flip it over to the wrong side, and draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other. And I like to use a smallish ruler for that. And I just line it up. And I have made the half square triangle quilt block in several of my videos, so feel free to fast forward through this part, or you could just use it as a little refresher. I'll be trimming the patch to 4.5 inches, so I'm starting with 5-inch squares. And then I'll just repeat that on this as well. Now place the light and the dark colored fabrics right sides together. And I'll take it to the machine and I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam on each side of my drawn line. And if you like, you can pin these fabrics together. They're small enough that you don't have to. Again, I'm using my leader fabric and a 1/4 inch on each side of my drawn line, which my drawn line will be my cutting line. And I'll feed my next fabrics right in. These ones I'll just feed through without pinning. Now cut the blocks apart on your cutting line that you've drawn. And now to press, again I'll be pressing toward the dark, so I just put my dark fabric on top, open up. Actually, first I will set my stitches. Now I'll open up, give it a little finger press, and press. I'll repeat that with the other patches. Now I'll trim each patch down to 4.5 inches square, and again I'm using my Quilt in a Day ruler, and it has the diagonal line here, which I'll line up with my seam. And here's my 4.5 inch line right here. And all I'm doing now, I'll line up the diagonal and the seam, and I'll make sure that there's a little excess fabric around each of the 4 sides beyond my 4.5 inch mark. So I have a little bit here, 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 and here. And make sure this is lined up exactly in your corner. This is lined up, and I'll trim the top and my right side. Now I'll flip the patch around so the opposite side is on top. This time I'll line up again the diagonal line, but I'll line up exactly at the 4.5 inch marks on this side and on the bottom. Make sure this is exactly in the corner. Trim and trim. Make sure that I got that. And you have a perfectly squared up 4.5 inch half square triangle. And I'll repeat that off camera with my other 3 patches. Now I'll place my patches in their right positions for constructing the block. So you have your 4 patches on each corner, and in one direction you want light colors, and in the other direction you want the darks. You can see right along here, and there's your darks. And then your half square triangles, the darks will go towards each other. And again, same thing here. Now to sew your patches together to form your block. This part I always have to be very careful because I get kind of confused sometimes between here and the sewing machine. So what I like to do is fold the centers over to the left, like so, and then I take a pin and I'll pin, this is just a rough pin, and it shows me where I want to start sewing and the direction I want to sew. I'll take it over to the machine, I'll sew a scant 1/4 inch seam along each of these, and then I'll come back and lay it back out. Make sure my ends are lined up. And I'll repeat that with my other 2 sets. And make sure I have them in the proper positions. So I have my dark squares here, my light squares here, and then my dark half square triangles are facing each other. So now I'll do the same thing. Flip this over. And roughly pin where I want to begin to sew and the direction I'll be sewing. Again, a 1/4 inch seam allowance, a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance right down here, and I'll do that off camera. Now that I have my 3 rows sewn together, I'll take them over to the pressing area and give them a press. And I'll want the top and the bottom seam allowances to go in one direction, and then my center to go in the opposite direction. And a real easy way that I do this is I just pick up the top from the right hand side and the bottom from the right hand side and take it to the iron and give it a press, and I'll show you that over at the pressing area right now. So I've held it from the right hand side, so then all I'll do is I'll set my seam, finger press, pull it down, do the next seam, set my seam, and finger press, and press. And I bring my piece that I've just pressed right back over to my area where I have the strips laid out, just so I can keep track of which direction I'm pressing. So I'll go ahead and do the bottom. Again, grab it from the right and take it to the pressing area. Now I have my bottom piece pressed, and I'll show you, I'll grab the center piece from the left this time and take it to the pressing area and give it a press. Holding it from the left, set the seam, give it a little finger press, and you do have to be careful. Sometimes this, when you're finger pressing, it gets quite hot. Okay, now my center piece right here. And now you can see that the seam allowances will be going in the opposite direction. So the top and the bottom are going toward the right, and the center is going to the left. And to finish constructing the block, you simply right sides together. And pin. And I will pin here, again indicating where I want to begin sewing and the direction. And here it'll be important to match up the seam allowance here and the seam allowance here. I'll take it to the machine, again a scant 1/4 inch seam right along here. And you can either pin to match up these seams, or you can use a little fabric glue. This is just some glue from Sewn. And I'll just put a little dab right at the seam. And match those up. And just give it a little pinch. And I'll repeat that down here at this seam. Now I'm ready to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam right along here. Cut off. Okay, open that up. And my intersections look pretty good. And now for my last segment, again, right sides together. I'll pin, and I'll do this off camera, a little dab of glue here and here. Scant 1/4 inch seam allowance right along here. Now for a final press, here's my last segment I just attached. So I will set the seam, and actually I will finger press, press, repeat that with my final seam. And I always like to measure my block at the end to make sure it measures the 12.5 inches square. And it does. Looks just great. So there you have it, the Jacob's Ladder quilt block. It's a pretty easy quilt block to make, but I did want to mention that I really like to take my time with it and measure after each segment that I make. It just ensures a really beautiful outcome. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.